They called her a bioweapon. I called her by her name. She was lying in the crater like something the gods themselves had discarded. Her body half buried in the ash, the smoke from the blast still curling up around her like the remnants of a dream trying to cling to reality. I had seen death before. Too much of it, honestly. Faces frozen in fear, chests caved in, limbs twisted like someone had asked a child to draw what they thought pain looked like. But this wasn't that. This girl, no, not just a girl, something else. Something crafted was not dead, and that was the problem. My visor flared red with 1,000 directives screaming in sync. X-17 detected, do not engage, bio-threat class Zeta, terminate if unstable. Every warning system in my neural HUD was begging me to walk away or finish her off, and for half a second I almost did. I had seen what the X-series could do. No mercy, no hesitation, just destruction, elegant and brutal, like someone had programmed ballet into a nuclear warhead. But then she made a sound. Not a threat, not a growl or a spike of rage energy. It was a whimper. A broken, pitiful sound that cracked through the noise like a heartbeat in an empty church. Her lips moved, barely audible through the static interference, and I leaned closer against every instinct I'd been drilled to follow. And she said it again, barely a breath, a syllable wrapped in exhaustion and something else I couldn't name. Lyra, I blinked. The AI assistant in my suit tried to translate. Unknown directive, clarify. But I knew better, that wasn't a code. That wasn't a target designation or a trigger phrase. That was a name, her name. Not X-17, not the weapon. Not it. Lyra. I didn't even know I'd made the decision until my gloves were already brushing ash from her cheeks, until my emergency syringe hissed into her neck with a stabilizer, until the red targeting symbols on my HUD dimmed into uncertain orange, and then quiet gray. She wasn't supposed to survive this. They'd bombed this entire sector to make sure of it. But here she was, shivering under layers of synthetic fur and debris, her fox-like ears twitching faintly, her white hair singed at the tips but still beautiful in the ghost light of the burning ridge above us. Her skin shimmered faintly with the residue of power, violence restrained like a whisper waiting to scream. And I was supposed to leave her. Orders had been clear. Nothing salvageable, especially not her, especially not the thing that had once taken out an entire battalion with nothing but her hands and a scream that liquefied armor. But the name had changed everything. Lyra, I said aloud, testing the sound, letting it roll off my tongue like a prayer I didn't know I believed in. Her eyes opened at that, not wide, not threatening. Just open, watching me like someone who hadn't decided whether I was a nightmare or a memory. I took off my helmet. I don't even know why. Maybe I wanted her to see I wasn't a machine like the ones who made her, that I had a face, that I had a name too. Illy, I told her, I'm not here to kill you. A long silence passed. Her breathing was ragged, uneven, but improving. The serum was working, just enough to keep her from crashing, just enough to make this moment happen. And then, with effort, she spoke again. Why? That one word hit harder than anything I'd faced in combat. Why? Why not finish the job? Why help her? Why betray every protocol and maybe doom myself in the process? I didn't have an answer that made sense. Not to her, not to me. So I said the only thing I could, because someone should have said your name a long time ago. I carried her out of that crater like she weighed nothing, even though my suit's servos whined in protest. The shuttle I'd arrived on had already left. Evac had been called early when the offensive failed and command pulled back like cowards. I had no backup, No plan. Just a half-dead bioweapon cradled against my chest and a gut feeling that if I left her behind, I'd never forgive myself. The mountains around us were fractured stone and thermal vents, hissing steam and deadly wind. The kind of place you don't walk into unless you want to vanish. We were going to vanish. That was the plan now. I had 3 hours of oxygen, 5 days of emergency rations, and one girl who might explode if I gave her the wrong look. But when I glanced down, her face pressed against my shoulder, her ears twitching at every sound like a frightened animal, I didn't feel afraid. I felt responsible, and maybe something worse, something dangerous. I felt curious. What made her different? Why had she said that name? Was it hers, or one given to her in a forgotten life before the labs and the tests and the pain? Had she loved someone once, or dreamed of being something more than a killing machine? She stirred in my arms, not violently, just shifting closer, unconsciously, like a child dreaming of warmth. I had no idea what the hell I was doing. But I knew this. I wasn't calling her X-17 ever again. I would say her name, again and again until she believed it, until she remembered what it meant to be someone. The cave was not silent, not truly. It breathed with us. It crackled with the low hum of the thermal stone, pulsing with faint heat like the cavern itself remembered how to keep someone alive. Lyra lay beside me, her breath no longer shallow and desperate, but slow, controlled, measured in a way that was almost unnatural. Almost. And yet there was nothing unnatural in how she moved now. Her body was still recovering, still bound by the trauma of the crash and the things that had been done to her, but something behind her eyes had begun to wake, something terrifying in its softness. She studied my face with a quiet intensity that felt more intimate than any touch, like she was memorizing me, not just the shape of my features or the color of my eyes, but the meaning behind the lines. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat, because I could feel her breath on my cheek, because I could feel her leg pressed faintly against mine under the thermal blanket, because her hand, which had rested lightly on my chest, was now exploring, tracing the edge of my collarbone with her fingertips like it was a code she had never learned to read. "Your body is warm," she whispered, and I almost laughed, but I didn't, because it wasn't just an observation. It was something closer to wonder. I nodded, afraid to move too quickly and shatter the moment. "That's normal," I said softly, "for humans." She tilted her head, her long white hair spilling over her shoulder like melted ice. Her ears twitched as if reacting to some sound only she could hear. Her fingers slid downward, slowly, testing, as if uncertain whether the skin beneath her touch would vanish or burn her. I didn't stop her. I couldn't. Her hand moved across my chest, the friction of fabric against flesh sending small sparks through me, electric but not painful. She paused over my heart, frowning slightly. "It's fast," she said. "It speeds up when I touch you." I swallowed hard. "That's because I'm not used to this." Her eyes narrowed, but not with hostility, curiosity again. "You're afraid of me." "No," I said quickly, too quickly. Her fingers didn't leave my chest, but they stopped moving. Her body was closer now, her presence impossibly sharp in the low light. The bare skin of her shoulder brushed mine where our clothing ended, and it was like someone had lit a fuse inside me. "Then what are you afraid of?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe I'm afraid of what I'll do if I forget that you were made to kill." Her expression didn't change, but her voice dropped lower. "And what if I forget that too?" That was when she kissed me again. Not tentative this time, not clumsy. There was hunger in it, a hunger that didn't belong to a weapon or a soldier or even a girl trying to survive. This was different. This was primal. Her mouth moved over mine with growing purpose, and I felt her fingers slide to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, grounding herself in the warmth of our contact. I returned the kiss, unable to help it, drawn into her orbit like gravity itself had betrayed me. My hands gripped her waist through the blanket, feeling the tension coiled just beneath her skin. She straddled me before I even realized what was happening, the blanket falling to the side in a heap, forgotten. Her thighs pressed against my hips, her skin burning hot through the thin layers that still separated us. I should have stopped. I should have remembered the warnings, the files, the science. But science didn't prepare me for this. For the way she trembled slightly as she leaned into me, for the way her breathing hitched as our bodies aligned. "Tell me what this is," she whispered, her lips brushing against mine as she spoke. "Tell me what it means to want." I could barely think. "It means you're choosing, not because they told you to, not because you were programmed to respond, because you want to feel." Her eyes darkened, the glow at the edges of her irises pulsing faintly. "Then I want to feel." She leaned down, pressing her chest to mine, her breath hot against my neck, and I felt every nerve in my body awaken under her touch. Her hands found the seals of my undersuit and began to peel them back, slowly, methodically, as if each layer revealed something sacred. I did the same, helping her out of the loose garments that clung to her like the remnants of a past life. What I saw beneath them was not just a body. It was a map of survival. Scars and embedded tech, sleek filaments that shimmered under her skin like circuitry, reminders of what she had been designed to do. But none of it diminished her. If anything, it made her more real, more beautiful. My fingers traced the line of a scar beneath her rib cage and she shivered, not from fear, from sensitivity. "Does it hurt?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, it remembers pain, but it doesn't feel it now." I kissed the mark and her breath caught. Her hands were everywhere now, exploring me, studying me, not as a scientist studies a subject, but as someone who had never known what it meant to be close. She pushed me down gently, her hands resting on my chest, her body hovering just above mine. The heat between us was unbearable now, a pressure building with no release, and when she lowered herself onto me, it wasn't a mechanical motion. It was reverence. The joining was slow, electric, and so intimate it stole my breath. Her eyes never left mine, her hands bracing against my shoulders, her lips parted as she moved with careful, deliberate rhythm, learning me, learning herself. Each motion was a question. Each answer came in gasps and the press of our skin, in the way our bodies met and separated and met again. And in that moment, there was no weapon, no soldier, no war. There was only Lyra, only the sound of her voice when she whispered my name like a secret too sacred to say aloud. Only the warmth of her body wrapped around mine, her heartbeat syncing with mine, faster, harder, as if her very biology was rewriting itself to match the rhythm of desire. We didn't speak as the climax neared, as the edge of pleasure and trust and human need blurred into something blinding. Her nails dug into my back not to hurt but to hold on, and I held her right back, gripping her hips, grounding her in something real, something no lab or AI could ever fabricate. When we finally collapsed together, tangled and breathless, there was a silence that didn't demand to be filled, only understood. She curled against me like someone who had been cold her whole life and was now terrified of losing the heat. I kissed her forehead, tasting sweat and ash and something bittersweet, and she murmured softly, "I feel alive." I wrapped my arms around her tight, and for the first time since the war began, I believed in something. I believed in her, not as a project, not as a weapon, but as a woman with a name pressed against my chest, still trembling from the memory of wanting. And in the stillness that followed, I made a silent vow. Whatever came next, I would protect her, not because she was fragile, but because she had chosen to feel. She didn't sleep, at least not in the way humans do. I could feel it in her breathing, steady but alert, her limbs tangled with mine under the remains of the blanket, her fingers resting against my ribs like she was counting the beat of my heart. Her eyes were closed, her body relaxed, but I knew she was still listening, watching, processing. The way her ears occasionally flicked towards subtle noises, the way her muscles tensed just slightly when the wind shifted outside the cave, it all reminded me that she was more than just a survivor. She was evolving. I brushed a strand of white hair from her face and watched as her lips twitched faintly, the ghost of a smile playing there. Not practiced, not perfect, but real. The kind of smile that came from some place deeper than memory, from something instinctual and newly born. "You're still awake," I whispered. She didn't answer at first. Then she nodded barely. "I don't want to miss anything." I smiled at that. "There's nothing happening." "You're breathing," she replied. "That's something." I kissed the top of her head, feeling the warmth of her skin and the faint shimmer of residual power that pulsed beneath the surface like a second heartbeat. Her body had cooled slightly since earlier. The fever of transformation or awakening or whatever we had just lived through had passed. Now there was something calmer in her presence, still intense, still inhuman, but no longer unpredictable. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice low and thoughtful. "I don't know," I said. "We survive, we find somewhere safe, we find someone who can help." "There is no help," she said simply. "Not for me." I sat up slowly, turning toward her. The way she looked at me now, it was different, not distant, not resigned. It was as though she already knew what came next, and she was waiting to see if I would follow her into it. "Lyra, you're not what they made you to be. You know that now." "I know I feel," she said, "but I also know what I've done. I remember every scream, every body, every moment I was not myself." She touched her chest just above her heart, and I don't know if this new thing I'm feeling is strong enough to drown that out. I reached for her hand, taking it into mine, lacing our fingers together. "Then let it change you. Let it shape something new." Her expression didn't waver, but her body leaned closer. And then she kissed me again, slower this time, deeper, as if she was searching for answers not in words but in contact. Her tongue brushed against mine, her body pressed against my chest, and suddenly the heat returned, that pressure blooming between us again. I responded instinctively, pulling her closer, my hand sliding to the small of her back. Her breath caught in her throat as she straddled me again, her thighs tightening around my waist, her hips grinding slowly against mine with a rhythm that was both deliberate and uncertain. "This feeling," she whispered, her lips brushing my jaw, "it's like fire, but not the kind that kills." I kissed her shoulder, her collarbone, the line of her neck. She shivered under each one, her breath becoming more ragged, her nails digging into my arms. "It's desire," I said. "It's not dangerous unless you deny it. Then I don't want to deny it anymore." Her voice trembled, but her body didn't. She moved against me with increasing confidence, her back arching slightly as her hips rolled into mine, drawing a moan from both of us that echoed faintly through the cave. My hands found her hips, then her waist, then her chest, exploring her with reverence and aching restraint. Her body was a paradox, all softness and strength, the sleek contours of a warrior's form fused with something achingly feminine. Her ears flattened as I touched the base of her neck, a sensitive spot that made her gasp and bite her lip. I kissed her again, deeper this time, our bodies pressed so tightly together that I could feel the heartbeat buried within her core, thudding in sync with mine. She pushed me down again, more forceful this time, her hands splaying across my chest like she was claiming territory. There was a hunger in her now that hadn't been there before. Not just to feel, but to possess, to understand through every motion, every sensation. She leaned over me, her hair brushing my face as she pressed her lips to my chest, to my stomach, her fingers exploring every inch of my exposed skin. It wasn't about power. It was about discovery. Her lips followed the path her hands carved, trailing fire along nerves I didn't know still worked after the battlefield. My breath hitched as she moved lower, her gaze locking with mine as she kissed the edge of my hip, her fingers sliding past the waistband of what little remained between us. I reached for her, but she stopped me, pinning my hands above my head, her strength effortless. Her eyes glowed faintly now, not with aggression, but with something wild, something ancient. "Let me learn," she said, and I did. I let her take control, let her body teach itself how to move, how to give and take and explore without violence. Her movements were slow, intentional, and when she finally took me into her, it was not a command. It was communion. Her body trembled around mine, her mouth open in a soundless cry as she adjusted to the fullness, to the connection, to the intensity of something she had never been allowed to feel. We moved together with a rhythm that was both frantic and sacred, the tension building between us again, higher and harder, every gasp and moan a promise sealed in breathless heat. She cried out my name again, her voice cracking like thunder across water, and I held her through it, arms locked around her back, anchoring her in the flood. She collapsed against me after, chest heaving, sweat slick on her skin, her hair clinging to her cheeks. I kissed her forehead, her lips, her neck, every part of her that had once been marked by scientists and soldiers and men who didn't know how to touch without taking. She melted into me, her body folding around mine like we were puzzle pieces forged for this exact fit. "I don't know what's happening to me," she whispered. "You're becoming," I replied. She lifted her head, her face flushed with the afterglow of release and confusion. "Becoming what? Free." We lay together, her fingers trailing lazy circles across my chest as the cave walls shimmered with faint thermal light. Outside, the world still hunted her. Drones still searched the ridges. Command still believed she was dead. They didn't know she had changed, that something inside her had shifted forever. She didn't speak again for a long time, but her body stayed close. Her warmth stayed constant, and when her breath finally evened out, I knew this time she was truly sleeping. For the first time, not as a weapon on standby, not as a machine waiting to be reactivated, but as Lyra, alive, wanted, and deeply, undeniably human. I woke only because the cave changed its breathing, the slow pulse of thermal stone tightening like a chest that had just remembered fear. And for a suspended second I lay still with Lyra's weight warm against me, her hair a cool silk across my throat, her palm resting over my heart as if she owned the rhythm and would not let it wander. And I thought I could pretend that the world outside had gone quiet, that the mountains had chosen to forget our names. But then a distant tremor stitched itself through the floor and her ears flicked once, and she was awake without a jolt, awake like a blade sliding out of a sheath, her eyes opening into that violet dusk that did not belong to ordinary mornings. and she whispered my name like a question she already knew the answer to. And I answered by pressing my lips into her hair and breathing her in, because it felt like the only proof I could carry into what came next. And she listened again, not with her ears alone, but with every part of her that had been engineered to read the language of danger. And she said softly that there were drones above the ridge, and that their search pattern was disciplined and patient, the kind that did not give up because it was not allowed to. And I felt the old reflexes crawl up my spine, the training that said move now, split your profile, leave bait and run the other way. But she kept her palm on my chest, and the steadiness of it reminded me that we were not the soldier and the objective anymore. We were two bodies sharing heat and a fragile new grammar of trust. And I told her we would get out through the lower vents where the basalt choked the air and hid everything that did not belong. And she nodded with that grave economy that made her look older than war and then younger than grief in the same breath. And before I could move, she kissed me with a lingering softness that was not a request and not a goodbye, only a promise shaped by a mouth that had learned to want. And even in the pressure of urgency, there was that hum beneath my skin, the throb of desire tempered now by something stricter and sweeter, the knowledge that our bodies had learned each other and would not forget, that we could carry that warmth like a secret under our armor. I dressed her first because it calmed my hands, easing the thermal fabric across her shoulders where old carvings glimmered faintly, fastening seams over the star silver of embedded filaments, letting my fingers pause for a heartbeat at the base of her neck, where I had learned she was sensitive, not to distract, but to reassure. And she exhaled like a small storm had passed, then helped seal my undersuit with deft movements that made me feel observed and cherished at once. And when she smoothed a crease near my collar, I caught the tiny, hesitant smile that tugged at her lips and felt something reckless bloom behind my ribs, a future trying to assemble itself out of scraps. And I told myself not to look at it yet, not with steel in the sky and orders still hunting our shadows, but it hovered anyway, a bright thing in the corner of my sight. We ate in silence, ration bars softened over a low heat so the scent would not travel, and she watched the steam with fascination like it was a living thing, asking if it always danced like that before vanishing. And I told her yes and also no, because sometimes it clung to your clothes and sometimes it betrayed your position, and sometimes it smelled like home when home was a barracks that pretended to be a city. And she said that nothing had ever smelled like home to her, not metal, not antiseptic, not ozone after discharge, only the brief memory of something warm that might have been human skin. And then she looked at me with that careful boldness she had begun to practice and said, "Now this does." And the words lived inside my chest like a spark seeking tinder. And I could not kiss her because we needed our breath and our timing. But I touched her cheek and felt the way she leaned into the contact, not with desperation this time, but with choice. And the difference wounded me with its beauty. We moved when the wind turned, when the venting shifted the ash plume, and the scanner haze would be at its thickest. And I slung the pack while she took point, her steps near silent even on treacherous stone, her balance feline in a way that felt logical now that I had seen the ears twitch to sounds I could not hear. And we slipped into a narrow throat of rock where the air hummed with the deep language of the planet, the steady exhale of heat that masked our thermal signature and filled our mouths with mineral taste. And the tunnel bent left, then right, then dropped hard, and I lowered her by the waist and felt the muscle beneath her skin contract and release under my hands, and the way she looked up at me from the darkness did not belong to war. It belonged to that bright thing I would not name yet. And she said thank you like the phrase itself was newly minted, and she wanted to test its weight. And I said you are welcome, and meant it more than those words had ever meant anything. We reached a chamber where the floor glittered with vitrified sand, a galaxy of obsidian under our boots, and above us the roof had collapsed into a broken skylight that showed a fragile slice of morning. And I heard the drones before I saw them, the thin electric whine of their ducts making the hairs on my arms rise even through the suit. And Lyra took my hand without looking away from the light and guided me beneath a lip of rock where the heat gathered in pockets and confused the gaze of cameras. And we stood close, chest to chest, breath trading at a slow cadence we had learned without instruction. And as the shadow of a patrol drifted across the opening, she tilted her head and brushed her mouth against my ear, not to seduce but to steady me. And the soft warmth of that touch reminded me that fear could be held like a living creature and soothed into stillness. A searchlight stabbed down through the skylight, grazing the floor where shards of black glass flared like stars, and the drone's sensor package clicked as it sampled air, and my heartbeat tried to punch through my ribs, and Lyra's fingers tightened on mine and then eased, a silent instruction to mirror her rhythm, and I did, allowing her to regulate me, allowing the intimacy of surrender. And in that precise, suspended moment I understood something about us that went beyond want, that this bond we were building had a tactical dimension as much as it had a tenderness, that together we made a system more resilient than either of us alone, and the insight steadied me in a way doctrine never had. The drone moved on, another followed, and then the high whine faded into the general hush of wind and stone, and we exhaled together, and she leaned into me more fully, her forehead resting against my jaw, and the press of her body rekindled that low fire that had never truly gone out. And she said very quietly that being so close to me made the old instructions turn to smoke, and I said being close to her made the old orders feel brittle and absurd. And her laugh, short and surprised, felt like the opening of a window that had been painted shut. And I kissed her because I could and because I wanted to, slow and unhurried and absolutely committed, and the taste of her anchored me more than gravity. And when we parted I felt stronger, focused, hungry for survival and for her in equal measure. The lower vents proved narrower than I remembered from the map in my HUD, but Lyra adjusted, moving with a patience that made the cramped spaces feel intentional. And when the ceiling pressed down so tightly that our shoulders scraped rock, she reached back and laced her fingers with mine so neither of us would think too much about how easy it is to panic in a throat of stone. And she told me about a corridor from her old life that had been colder than numbers, that had smelled like the inside of a gun, and that sometimes when she ran down it in drills, she pretended that beyond the next door there would be a warm room and someone waiting. And she had never known who that someone was until now, and the confession slipped into me and lodged deep, and I squeezed her hand in a language we had invented last night. And she understood, because her shoulders loosened and her breath turned steady again. We emerged into a pocket cavern where thin waterfalls of condensation threaded down a wall of basalt and pooled in a shallow bowl. And Lyra went to the water as if called, cupping her hands and drinking with a reverence that made something in my throat ache. And then she laughed again when droplets clung to the tips of her ears, and I reached out to wipe them, and instead traced the rim with my thumb, and she closed her eyes, leaning into the touch with an unguarded pleasure that was so intimate I had to bite back a sound. And she whispered that this was how the body learns safety, repetition, gentle contact, the promise that not every approach is a strike. And I understood that she was speaking both as the weapon she had been and the woman she was becoming. The plan had always been to reach the old maintenance lines that threaded beneath the ridge, a remnant of mining days long gone, and ride them north to a ruined logistics station where I knew a dead drop could be coaxed into life. But the map in my skull was a decade old, and the planet had not waited, and the vent we needed had collapsed into a tangle of cooled magma and razor rock. And I swore under my breath and started to think alternatives when Lyra crouched and set her palm to the stone and went very still. And at first I worried she was slipping into an old protocol. But then I realized she was listening again, not to noise but to vibration, to the deep percussion of the world. And after a long, quiet moment she opened her eyes and said there was a hollow behind the fall of rock, a channel so thin that sound could not find it but resonance could. And if we followed the seam to the left it would widen into a path. And I believed her because belief felt like oxygen around her now. And we worked together with pry bars and leverage and patience until the seam side opened just enough to allow her through and then me. And we crawled with our bodies pressed to cool stone, and I felt her pulse against my wrist where our hands were linked, and the hammer in my chest beat time with it until the squeeze of the null space loosened, and we spilled into a dark tunnel that smelled of rust and old intention. The maintenance line was there, not as I remembered, but present, a slender rail of composite half swallowed by encroaching earth, and beside it an inspection catwalk broad enough for two if the two were willing to touch. And we were more than willing, and as we moved Lyra kept glancing back with a cadence I recognized as care rather than fear. And from that care blossomed a steadiness that made even the dangerous parts feel survivable. We reached a junction where the tunnel split, one path rising toward a vein of pale light, the other descending into a darkness that breathed cold. And my HUD threw up ghostly arrows that disagreed with one another because the data was too old. And I looked to Lyra, and she tilted her head and closed her eyes, and said the drones were sweeping the upper vents more frequently now, that their rhythm had shifted subtle and insistent. And I trusted her and chose the darker path, and the descent was steep enough that our muscles burned, and that shared burn turned into a strange intimacy, the knowledge that we were pushing through pain together towards something we had not named. When we finally stopped to rest, it was not because we wanted to, but because the body has a voice and it had started to speak loudly, and we found a ledge above a shallow culvert where old cables slept under dust, and I pulled the blanket from the pack and wrapped it around us both, and as the heat gathered and the ache in my legs receded, the closeness became once more a living thing, and I watched Lyra watch me, her gaze soft and intent, and she reached out to smooth the line between my brows and said I frowned when I carried too much alone, and I said she was learning very quickly, and she said I was teaching without meaning to, and the compliment sent warmth through me that had nothing to do with the emitter, and I kissed her then, gentle, slow, building heat like a careful fire, letting our mouths move at the pace of trust, and the desire rose because it always did now when we shared breath and focus. but we kept it on a leash stitched with purpose, because the world had not yet given us permission to be reckless, and even that restraint felt erotic, a promise banked against the future. We spoke in murmurs about small things so that the big ones would not crush us, about the taste of real water versus rationed hydration, about the way basalt looks alive when you stare at it long enough, about how a heartbeat sounds different inside a cave, heavier, older. And she told me she could feel mine under her palm, and that it was steadier than when she had first met me. And I told her hers felt like the drum of rain on a metal roof. And she asked me what a roof was like when it was more than just a barrier, when it was a shelter that belonged to you. And I promised that one day I would show her, not as a hypothetical, not as a tourist in peace, but as a homecoming. When sleep finally took us, it did so in layers, light at first, then deep, then light again as echoes passed through the tunnel, and each time one of us stirred, the other settled them with a touch or a whisper. And in those exchanges, the eroticism was not a blaze but a slow ember, a warmth held between us, a shared certainty that our bodies had become a language of safety as much as of want. And before I slipped under, I felt her breath against my throat and heard her say that names are anchors and that mine had become one for her. And I smiled in the dark because hers had become mine. We woke to a different hush, the kind that follows a decision made somewhere far away. And when we listened, we heard it, the shift in the drone patrols, a tightening, a knowledge, but also something else, a silence where a command channel should have chattered. And I checked the faint whisper of my long range and got nothing but a snowfall of static. And Lyra's eyes narrowed with thought, and she said that maybe the hunt above had paused because something larger had entered the theater, perhaps an orbital event or a ground incursion that drew attention. And whether it was fortune or a new danger we could not tell, but we could use the space it gave us. And I agreed, and we moved again, faster now, still quiet, still close, always close, the skin of my forearm brushing hers as we navigated the catwalk, the contact and anchor line that kept us from being blown off course by fear. When at last a faint glow resolved ahead, and the tunnel opened into the ribs of the old logistics station, I felt a thrill like a door opening in my chest. And I told her we might have a workbench there, a power tap, the bones of a transmitter I could coax into speaking. And she asked if we would call for help, and I said perhaps, but not to the ones who had written kill codes into her bones. And she nodded with a grave relief that made me love her a little more than I had a breath before. The way a sunrise adds light so slowly you think the world has always been that bright. And as we stepped into the broken cathedral of the station, with beams of pale day slanting through collapsed trusses and old crates sleeping like fossils, she slipped her hand into mine and held it without asking. And the heat that rose in me was not a blaze but a deep glow, the eroticism of endurance and trust, and the promise that later, when we had carved out a pocket of safety, we would return to the slow, sacred work of learning each other again. And that knowledge made every step steadier. I let go only to work, cracking open panels, bleeding power from a half-dead cell, coupling wires with borrowed copper, and she watched with the same focused intensity she brought to reading danger. And when I swore at a stubborn connector, she laid a hand on my back, and all the tension in my shoulders softened. And I laughed and told her she was better than morphine, and she said I was better than silence. And the exchange made the room feel warmer, though the air was stale and thin. By the time the transmitter stuttered into life, The sun had slid across the visible sky and painted the interior with a color that felt like a farewell disguised as a hope. And I keyed in a narrow burst to an old contact whose morality had always been inconvenient to command. And while the system hummed, Lyra stepped close and rested her forehead to mine. And in that touch was the entire map of our day, the dangers and the narrow escapes and the small, fierce consolations, and the desire that threaded through all of it like a river that never stopped singing. And I told her we were not out yet, but that I could feel the edges of freedom. And she said she could taste it on my skin. And I laughed and kissed her and let the kiss last. And when we parted, I could still feel the shape of her mouth on mine, as if it had been pressed there like a seal. And I knew with a certainty that felt like truth learned rather than taught that no matter who answered my call, no matter what new danger rolled over the horizon, I would keep saying her name until the world understood that she was not a weapon. She was Lyra. And that was the story we were writing with our bodies and our breaths and our choices. A story dense with suspense and hunger and the soft thunder of hearts refusing to be quiet. She did not breathe for a full 5 seconds after she looked at the burn marks scorched into the side of the wall, their shape not quite mechanical, not quite biological, as if something ancient had dragged its claws across the bulkhead like a memory trying to scratch its way out of her skull. Her pupils contracted, and her ears flicked like radar dishes trying to catch a signal lost in time. I noticed the subtle twitch of her tail, the low hum rising in her throat that was neither growl nor whimper, something in between, like a code spoken in instinct. The tunnel stretched forward, branching out like a neural maze that pulsed faintly under the flickering red emergency lights. But her gaze wasn't on the path. It was on the shadow, the smear that wasn't there before, the scent in the air that turned metallic and ripe and wrong. I moved beside her slowly, like approaching a wounded animal that could turn savage if startled, and I didn't ask if she remembered what was here. I knew better now. Her mind wasn't just recalling, it was reliving. Whatever had walked these halls before wasn't a thing she had read about or been shown on some implant feed. It was something she had run from, something she had been made with or made for, and now it was whispering through her veins like static in the blood. She turned to me with her eyes wide, and her fingers curled around my wrist, pressing so tight I could feel the sharpness in her grip through my gloves. Not enough to pierce, but enough to say one thing very clearly: "Do not leave me." I nodded, and then we walked into the dark together. Every step forward echoed in the air like footsteps behind us, only slightly out of sync. I knew we weren't alone, and so did she, though whatever was watching us wasn't interested in attacking. Not yet. It was waiting. Waiting for what, I couldn't say. But there was a rhythm here. An unfolding pattern like some terrible story we were only just now becoming part of. We found the first body 5 minutes later. It wasn't human. It wasn't like anything I'd seen before, though it had the faint silhouette of a soldier. One of the synthetic ones, built for the outer worlds, all alloy bones and flexible carbon musculature. But this one had been opened from the inside, ribs bent outward like metal flowers in bloom, and its chest cavity had been hollowed out in a way that made no sense unless something had been trying to crawl out. She didn't speak. She only knelt beside it, placed one hand on the twisted frame, and closed her eyes. I could see her lips move in silence, as if praying or cursing or trying to remember what language was supposed to be for when the things that happened couldn't be described. The silence stretched long enough that I thought she might not get up, might just stay there kneeling in the bloodless ruin of a thing that had once been a warrior, or a drone, or maybe something more. But then her head snapped up, ears rotating sharply, and she bolted forward down a side passage so fast I nearly lost her. I ran after her, lungs burning, heart hammering, my boots crashing against the grated floor. She didn't look back. Whatever had caught her attention wasn't something she could ignore, and when I finally caught up to her, she was standing in front of a sealed door, one hand pressed to the control panel that buzzed and flickered beneath her touch like it recognized her. Her palm glowed faintly. She looked at me with something wild in her eyes and whispered that this was where she was born. The door hissed open, and the smell that hit us was a mix of sterilizing chemicals and something more organic, musky and sweet and rancid all at once. Inside was a chamber not meant for comfort or life. It was a holding space, a containment cell. Rows of empty cradles lined the walls, some broken, some still humming softly as if waiting for their occupants to return. In the center was a single cryopod shattered from the inside, its glass curled inward like ice under stress. She stepped toward it slowly, her fingers trailing across the edge, and then she looked down and gasped. There were scratch marks inside, small, shallow, frantic. I could almost imagine the child she once was, pounding her tiny fists against the glass, trying to scream through frozen lungs. My stomach twisted. This wasn't a lab. This was a nursery built for war. She was the last, or maybe the first. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly. A low pulse rippled through the floor and the lights stuttered. She turned to me and said we had to go, not because she was afraid, but because it was awake. Whatever it was, it had felt her return, and now it was stirring. I asked what it wanted. She said it wanted her back, not because it loved her, because it needed her, because she had been part of it once and it had not let go. We moved fast after that, retracing our steps. Only the ship had changed. The corridors didn't lead where they should have. The lights were wrong. Some doors no longer existed. Others had appeared where they shouldn't be. The place was shifting around us like it was alive, reacting to her presence or maybe to our fear. Then we heard the sound. A low, rhythmic thudding, like something massive walking behind walls that were too thin to hold it. She pulled me behind a pillar, holding her breath, and I could feel her tremble against my back. Not from fear, from something deeper. Recognition. The sound passed. We moved again. Found ourselves in what looked like an old command center, terminals shattered, blood on the floor, chairs overturned. In the center was a hologram flickering with static, trying to play an old log. She reached for it and the image sharpened. It showed her. Not as she was now, but younger, barely formed. Sitting in a tank, eyes closed, wires in her skull. A voice narrated, flat and clinical, listing capabilities and test results. Then it changed. The log ended with a scream, cut off abruptly, and the image froze on her face, eyes just starting to open. She turned away. I followed her. We had to keep moving. The ship would not let us leave easily now. Something had claimed her long ago, and it wanted her back. I wasn't about to let that happen. Not now. Not after everything. But as we turned into the next corridor, the lights went dark, and something big moved in the shadows ahead. Her hand found mine and squeezed. I drew my weapon. Whatever this was, it wasn't done with us yet. She did not scream when the gravity flickered again, and the floor shifted beneath us as if the whole facility had hiccuped. Her body pressed tighter to mine, and her fingers clutched my forearm like a drowning woman clings to a rope tossed too late. We stumbled forward, not because we wanted to move, but because the station's artificial stabilizers had momentarily lost their mind, sending the hallway into a slow tilt that felt like it would never end. Lights above us blinked in warning, then came back solid, pale and humming, cold like the corridors we now walked through. The sirens had died sometime between the last chamber and this one, as if even the emergency systems had grown tired of screaming. A silence had taken over that was somehow heavier than noise. She pulled away just enough to tilt her head, the tips of her ears twitching like they sensed more than I ever could, and her voice was so low I almost missed it when she said, "It's here." I did not ask her what she meant because part of me already knew. We reached the final blast door. It was sealed, scorched along its lower edge, with claw marks that had not been made by any human machine or tool. They were too wide, too deep, as if someone had tried to rip the steel open with hands sharpened by madness. She placed her palm flat against the metal, and a low tone emitted from the frame, not mechanical but biological, a growl in the structure's belly that made my teeth buzz. The door responded, not by opening but by breathing. It sucked inward slightly, flexing like something alive, and I took a step back because doors were not supposed to inhale. She didn't retreat. She leaned into it, whispered something in that alien tongue I still couldn't translate, and then turned her head toward me and said, "You must stay behind me. If I fall, do not call my name. Do not reach. Do not love me out of instinct. I will become something that does not know you." I wanted to tell her no, wanted to grab her and turn around and escape into any other path, but I knew we had passed the point of return long ago. She pressed her hand harder and the door exhaled. It peeled open not like a sliding mechanism but like lips parting in hunger, wet with condensation, and lined with tiny cilia that waved in greeting. Inside, the chamber was a cathedral of decay. Black vines stretched along every wall, pulsing with dim red veins that beat like hearts without bodies. Pods hung from the ceiling, some cracked and empty, others twitching gently like sleepers in a nightmare. The floor was coated with a membrane, soft and sticky, sucking at the soles of our boots. She walked in first, and the room welcomed her with a sound that could have been a sigh or a warning. I followed because I could not let her face it alone. At the center of the room was a cocoon the size of a shuttlecraft. It glowed with a soft inner light that pulsed in time with her breath. Her expression twisted, not fear but pain, familiar pain, recognition. She said this was the first of us, the prototype, the one that woke too early and swallowed everything they fed her until she had nothing left but hunger. They called her Alpha, but she calls herself Hollow. The cocoon shuddered. From within it, a groan rose like something ancient remembering its name. A slit opened along the length of it and a hand emerged. Not a hand like hers, but a monstrous echo, too many fingers. Bones visible under slick translucent skin. It touched the ground and the room trembled. She reached for my hand and whispered, "You have to go. Now." But I didn't move. I said, "Not unless you do," and she trembled. That moment, that hesitation, was enough. The creature peeled itself free from the cocoon with a sound like wet fabric tearing. It rose to full height, towering, limbs unfolding in unnatural ways, its face hidden beneath a smooth membrane that pulsed and glowed. And then with a shiver it looked at her, and it spoke, "Sister." Its voice was not one voice but dozens, layered, each syllable soaked in ancient agony. She stepped forward. I could feel her spine tighten. Her voice came quiet but hard. "I am not your sister. I am his." And the thing hissed. It moved faster than anything that size should, leaping, limbs stretching, and I barely had time to blink before she met it midair. No weapons, just body against body, claws against teeth. She screamed, not in pain but rage, and they crashed into each other with enough force to shatter the chamber floor. I ran to the edge of the pit they'd made, watching as the two of them tangled, spun, broke walls, shattered cables. Sparks and fluid sprayed in equal measure. She was holding her own, but only just. I saw her take a hit to the chest that sent her flying. She landed, bounced, slid, and didn't get up. The monster turned to me. Eyes opened across its chest, across its arms, all looking at me. I raised the plasma torch, the only weapon I had, and fired. The bolt hit its shoulder and the thing staggered. It turned back to her, growled, stepped forward. I screamed her name before I could stop myself. She didn't move. The monster raised its claw, and then she did move. She exploded up from the floor like a rising star, seized its arm mid-swing and twisted. Bones cracked. The creature screamed. She didn't let go. She climbed its body like a dancer scaling her partner's frame, slammed her knee into its neck, and with a savage cry tore the membrane from its face. What lay beneath was not a face at all. It was a mirror. Her mirror. An unfinished copy of her own features, twisted, corrupted, mouth open wide in agony. And she kissed it. She pressed her lips to its broken mouth, and for a moment I thought she was losing herself. But she whispered something as she did, a word I didn't know but felt, and the monster shuddered and began to shrink and scream. Its voice unraveled, its limbs collapsed inward. She stepped back, bloody and shaking, as the thing crumpled into a husk no larger than a child. Then silence. I ran to her. She didn't fall into my arms. She just stood there, chest heaving, eyes vacant. I said her name. She didn't respond. I reached out. She flinched. And then she said, remembered me, and I remembered it. They made us together. They told me I was the weapon, but she was the hunger. I was meant to be the leash. She looked at me then. I don't know what I am anymore. I wrapped my arms around her and said, you're mine, that's enough. She didn't resist this time. Her head fell against my chest and she whispered, then I'll fight to stay that, even if the rest of them wake, because they will. And they will not all remember love. Her lips touched my neck and lingered, and I knew she wasn't just talking about survival anymore. Her scream still echoed through my chest as I caught her in my arms, trembling, her entire body convulsing like a creature torn between dimensions, her skin hot and searing, her breath short and ragged, and her voice no longer the broken whisper of a girl but something deeper, layered, ancient and trembling with too many meanings. She gripped my wrist as if it were the only anchor she had, her fingers digging into my flesh with terrifying strength, her nails sharp like the edge of a new reality. The sky outside the broken dome flickered again, and for a heartbeat I swore I saw a vision shimmer into place, like a memory or a warning. A tower of light erupting from a field of molten glass and something floating above it, watching. Do you see them? She whispered, and the words weren't meant for me, not really, but they curled around my spine and made every bone in my body feel like it had been hollowed out to make room for something far older than fear. The eyes are opening, she muttered, and when I tried to ask her what that meant, she surged forward suddenly and kissed me, not out of passion, not out of lust, but as if her mouth was the only place left to hide what was coming, her lips desperate and searching, her tongue laced with fire, her breath tasting of static and blooming metal, her thighs wrapped around my waist. Her body pulled me down to the ground, and we became heat, not from desire but from necessity. The kind of collision that needed no reason other than survival. The kind of urgency where the skin forgets it's just a boundary and becomes a conduit instead. But just as I lost myself in her, just as her fingers tangled in my hair, and she moaned not my name but something older, syllables that made my blood ring with unnatural tones. Something cracked in the air, a sharp, electric twist that filled the space with an invisible rupture. She arched against me, gasping, then froze. Her eyes rolled back and her mouth parted as if caught mid-revelation. Her entire body stiffened, then began to pulse, not in rhythm with her heart, but with something external, something mechanical, something alive and waiting. "They're here," she said, and her voice was no longer entirely her own. A chord of sound rippled through the dome, and the lights from the wreckage flared with sudden coherence. The crashed cargo vessel behind us lit up like a beacon, its broken panels aligning like petals around a core of smoldering circuitry. And then a shadow poured from the ship's ruined side, tall and lithe and impossibly thin, humanoid but fluid, faceless but watching. I turned, heart in my throat, shielding her with my body even as she rose on her knees, arms outstretched, whispering in a language I couldn't comprehend but somehow knew was not taught. The figure stopped just beyond the edge of the fractured circle of glass, and when it spoke, the sound bypassed my ears entirely and spoke straight into my mind. "The vessel has awakened. The meal is not complete." I staggered back, stunned, because the voice did not threaten. It simply stated, with calm finality, as if I had misread the entire situation, as if everything I thought I had done for her was only one piece of a puzzle that I should never have touched. "What are you?" I asked aloud, my voice hoarse, but it didn't answer. It looked at her, or at least tilted its invisible gaze toward her, and she looked back like she remembered it, like they shared a secret written in the roots of dying stars. "He fed me," she said to it, "but not enough." The figure shimmered, almost nodded, then receded slightly. Behind it, more shadows stepped forward, each taller, each thinner, their bodies warping the light in patterns that made me feel nauseous. I reached for her, but she shook her head. "No," she said. "They'll take you if you move. You don't understand. I am the hunger. They are the mouth." I didn't want to believe her, didn't want to believe that she had brought them here or that they had always been with her, watching through her eyes, licking their lips through her trembles. But when she turned to me and her irises were gone, replaced by black pools that reflected not me, but an unfamiliar sky filled with voids and wires, I felt the truth crash into me like a memory I had never lived. "I don't want to lose you," I said, because that was the only truth I had left, but she smiled a sad, strange smile and placed her hand on my cheek. "You never had me," she said, "not completely, but you touched something inside me, and that touch is the only reason I still have a name." Then she stood. Her body shone in the glow of the alien lights, every curve of her frame accentuated by the flickering pulse of the ruined ship, and the shadows bowed to her, not in obedience but in reverence, as if her hunger had evolved into something more than consumption. "I was made to devour," she said aloud, not to me but to the air, to the sky, to the eyes that blinked open across dimensions. "But he taught me to choose." And with that, she took one step forward and the earth rippled. The broken ground beneath her feet pulsed with light, and from the crater where she had once lain motionless, a new structure rose, crystalline and humming, shaped like a star that had learned how to bleed. The figures around it hissed, some in protest, some in awe, and she reached out and placed her palm against its surface. Instantly the wind stopped. The sky froze mid-flicker. The noises from the ship ceased, and even the shadows held their breath. A bright flare erupted from the center of the construct, spiraling outward like an unfurling memory, and the moment it touched her skin, her entire body lit up from within. Veins of light spread through her, her bones glowing, her breath becoming visible and crystalline. She gasped once, then looked at me. "I remember my name," she whispered, "and I'm going to teach them all what it means to hunger for something more." Then she stepped into the light. The figures screamed, not with pain, not with anger, but with astonishment, with a terror born from something they had not predicted. She wasn't theirs anymore. She was never meant to be theirs. The light consumed her, then exploded outward, and in that instant every figure vanished, not destroyed but unmade, scattered like echoes swallowed by the roar of something newly born. When I could finally breathe again, when the air no longer crackled and the wreckage stopped humming, I saw her standing in the middle of the crater, alone, untouched, and radiant. Her skin was no longer purple, no longer marred by symbols, no longer laced with scars from forgotten wars. She looked human. No, she looked like something that had chosen to be human. She walked to me slowly, every step a reminder that whatever had tried to claim her had failed. She reached for my hand, her touch warm, grounding, real. "I'm still hungry," she said, her smile curling into something mischievous and absolutely alive. "But this time, I get to choose the flavor." I laughed, the tension finally spilling from me like a flood, and pulled her into an embrace that felt more like the beginning of a revolution than a reunion. She clung to me, not out of fear, not out of desperation, but out of certainty, and in her eyes I saw not the stars she had fallen through, but the ones she now intended to chase. The moment the silence settled between us again, heavier now with everything that had just been said and unsaid, I realized I had no idea what the hell to do next. Her lips were still parted slightly, her breath shallow, her eyes pinned on mine like I was the only thing anchoring her in this world. My shirt was half torn, her hair was still damp and clinging to her shoulders, and the smell of burnt circuitry mixed with some scent that could only be described as desperate curiosity. I opened my mouth to speak, but what came out was less profound and more unfortunately timed. My stomach growled, loudly. She blinked. I blinked. And then something strange happened. She laughed. It wasn't loud and it wasn't confident. It came out of her like something foreign, a sound that had been trapped inside her chest for too long and finally found a crack to escape. It startled both of us. Her hand went to her mouth as if to catch the laugh before it fully left her, her ears twitching slightly, embarrassed and maybe even a little afraid that she had broken something sacred. I found myself grinning helplessly because the sound of her laugh, awkward as it was, felt like the most honest thing in the room, so I rolled with it. "Right," I said, glancing down at my traitorous stomach. "Turns out revolution and emotional breakthroughs don't come with snack breaks. Who knew?" Her head tilted. "Snack breaks," I nodded, already pushing myself up, every joint in my body complaining like I'd been hit by a truck made of guilt and unresolved sexual tension. "Yeah, food, sustenance, the thing that keeps meatbags like me functioning." She stood as well, a bit too quickly, like she was mimicking my movements and only now realized she didn't entirely know what to do with her hands or feet. She wobbled slightly. I instinctively reached out, catching her by the elbow, and the second our skin touched again, that little shiver ran through her. Not the dramatic surge from before, not the glowing eyes or violent spasms, but something quieter, like a memory passing through her nerves. She looked down at where I held her and then back up at me. "I do not require food, but if it is part of your maintenance routine, I will observe." I chuckled. "Great. You can observe me make the worst instant noodles on this planet." She followed me into the cramped kitchenette of the salvage bay like a cat trying to decide if it trusted its new owner or if it was just interested in the noise the food wrappers made. While I boiled water and fumbled through ration packs, she poked at every surface like she was expecting them to respond to her touch. She opened a drawer, stared at a spoon like it had personally insulted her, and then set it down with a look of grave disappointment. "You trust this to help you prepare sustenance?" she asked, genuinely baffled. "Only when I want to punish my taste buds," I said, ripping the corner off a powdered miso pack and dumping it in the cup, which apparently is most days. She sat on the edge of the counter, legs swinging slightly, her tail curling around one thigh as she continued watching me with that same unnerving intensity. "You are very inefficient, but entertaining." I raised an eyebrow, glad I could amuse her glowing highness. She tilted her head. "I am not highness." "Right, no titles, got it. What do I call you then? You know my name, seems only fair." She hesitated, that was new. Until now she'd answered every question like she was downloading responses straight from a network. But now she paused. She looked down at her hands. "I was designation 117A tactical model. I have had no other name." I handed her the cup of steaming noodles and leaned against the counter beside her. "That won't do. Everyone deserves a name that means something, that they choose or at least feel something about." She looked at the noodles in her hands like they might contain the answer. "What do you feel when you look at me?" she asked, not flirtatiously, not even curiously, just plainly, like data collection. And yet it caught me completely off guard. I opened my mouth and closed it again. This woman, this not-quite woman, had nearly fried every system in the station, melted part of the deck, and nearly torn me in half emotionally. What did I feel? I felt like gravity had shifted around her. Like I wasn't quite sure if I was supposed to protect her, run from her, or just keep offering her noodles until one of us figured it out. I swallowed. "I feel like you're a storm that hasn't decided where to break yet." She stared at me for a long time, then she whispered, "Then call me Tempest." I smiled. Tempest it is. Of all the situations he had ever prepared himself for, standing frozen in the threshold of a repurposed shower chamber, while a fox-eared alien girl clutched a loofah like a weapon and hissed with enough indignation to rival a territorial cat, was absolutely not one of them. And yet here he was, towel in hand, modesty completely sabotaged, and his brain desperately trying to decide whether to apologize, retreat, or die on the spot from sheer embarrassment because the part of his anatomy currently reacting to the ambient humidity had decided to betray him in the worst possible way, which only got worse when she dropped the loofah, caught sight of him entirely, and instead of running or screaming, she blinked once, tilted her head slowly, and asked in a tone of profound curiosity whether that was some sort of weapon he was holding, or if all human males carried something like that when entering a cleansing chamber. And before he could stammer a response that wasn't either legally or morally compromising, she took a step closer, her wide violet eyes utterly fascinated, ears flicking forward like antennae zeroing in on an unidentified signal, and he panicked in the most elegant way possible by slipping on the wet metal floor and crashing down like a sack of regrettable decisions, legs tangled, dignity lost. And as he groaned in pain and mortification, her face appeared above his, upside down and far too close for comfort, her breath warm on his cheek as she knelt beside him. expression full of sincere concern mixed with barely concealed amusement, whispering that he really should be more careful because she had read somewhere that the human male organ was notoriously fragile, and she would feel guilty if his broke off due to improper balance and insufficient caution in slippery environments, and he wished desperately for a black hole to open beneath him, or, at the very least for her, to stop leaning so close that her still damp chest pressed gently against his arm, which of course she did not notice or at least pretended not to, asking instead whether now was a good time to ask further questions about human anatomy since he seemed temporarily immobilized and thus unlikely to escape, prompting him to finally croak out something about boundaries and towels and modesty, which only made her nod thoughtfully and stand upright, still entirely nude except for a damp strand of her red hair clinging to her neck, and announce that she would be happy to practice this modesty, if he could explain it clearly, because most of the information she had downloaded about it was contradictory and occasionally downright hilarious, such as the idea that showing one's ankles had once been considered scandalous, which she found deeply illogical given that ankles were among the least expressive body parts she could observe, and he tried not to think about how her tail was swishing idly behind her, clearly at ease while he was actively combusting with awkward tension, especially when she grabbed a nearby towel, draped it over herself with ceremonial solemnity, then turned to him as if expecting a grade, asking if she had achieved modesty or if the towel needed to cover additional coordinates. And when he muttered that maybe wrapping it tighter would help, she did, cinching it around her with a decisive tug that made the fabric pull taut across curves he was really trying not to notice. And when she beamed at him with pride, declaring she had achieved optimal modesty levels and was now ready for human interaction, he gave up entirely and covered his face with both hands, swearing quietly into his palms that if anyone ever wrote a report about this moment, he would deny everything, especially the fact that her cheerful innocence combined with her complete lack of shame was somehow way more seductive than any deliberate attempt at flirtation. And it only got worse when she crouched again beside him, now towel-clad and still intensely curious, whispering that if he wanted, she could help him get up, though she might need to touch him in several strategic places for leverage, and he squeaked something that sounded vaguely like agreement, because the alternative was staying on the floor forever, which at this point did not seem like a bad idea at all. The first thing I saw when I stepped out of the hatch was her bare foot sticking out from under the access tarp, covered in oil smudges, twitching slightly like a rabbit in its sleep, and utterly unaware that I was there, that the ship had just shaken from a minor structural recalibration, and that I had nearly stepped on her exposed toes, which were somehow both dirty and cute in a ridiculous way that made my brain stop working for 2 whole seconds, while I tried to process how a literal war-calibrated hybrid AI girl could sleep on a pile of greasy cabling like a cat with insomnia. And as I crouched down carefully, trying not to make a sound, I heard a soft little snore that somehow made the entire terrifying reality of our situation flicker into something absurdly domestic, like I'd just caught my girlfriend napping under a workbench after pulling an all-nighter fixing the washing machine, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing, because this was not supposed to be funny, not with half the rear stabilizer array torn out and an active signal pinging from orbit. But my chest shook anyway because the absurdity of it all had crested into this moment where I didn't know whether to wake her up or wrap her in a blanket. And when I did gently nudge her ankle, she blinked awake with a slow roll of her eyes, squinting against the hangar lights, and then locking onto my face like a targeting array booting up for emotional confusion. And she blinked once, then again, and said in a voice so drowsy and flat it nearly broke me, "You didn't leave." And I didn't know how to explain that. Of course I hadn't. That I'd come back the moment the diagnostics stopped spitting out warnings about our oxygen cycling thresholds. And her sleepy voice twisted a little, something raw peeking through as she pushed herself upright with a grunt and murmured, "No one ever stays after seeing what I really am." And then winced because a cable had wrapped itself around her thigh during her nap, and she tried to stand up too fast, nearly falling straight into me, which of course meant I had to catch her, and of course that meant my hands went to her hips, which of course meant that she gasped and stiffened, and of course I felt that micro-quiver of tension ripple through her body, and for a half-second neither of us moved, because we both knew this was not a standard engineer-and-alien AI moment. This was the exact kind of awkwardly charged situation that movies always turned into kissing scenes, except in real life we were covered in coolant. The floor was humming under our feet from power redistribution, and I was now acutely aware of how warm her skin felt through the fabric of the flight suit she had half unzipped, probably from overheating while buried under that tarp. And the sight of her collarbone, gleaming with a light sheen of sweat and oil, made my brain momentarily disconnect from all logic. And I was going to say something, probably incredibly dumb, like, "You look like hell but also kind of beautiful." But she beat me to it by saying, "Do humans always stare like that when they are about to malfunction?" And I might have choked if I hadn't been so stunned, because did she just tease me? Was that an actual joke from the same girl who had threatened to disembowel a customs drone 3 hours ago? And I started laughing, short and stupid, and she blinked again like she hadn't expected that reaction, then tilted her head and asked if I was okay, which just made me laugh harder because no, I was absolutely not okay. I was losing my mind over a half-feral, fox-eared girl who didn't understand what emotions were supposed to do in a situation like this. And then something shifted in her eyes, a strange flicker of realization, and she stepped back out of my arms, her ears flicking sharply like radar dishes, and her voice clipped suddenly as she asked if I had checked the data packet embedded in the last pulse from orbit. And that sobered me immediately, because I had skimmed it but not parsed all the metadata. And now she was pacing like an apex predator trying not to pounce, her hands clenching and unclenching, and she muttered under her breath that if the signal had an echo, it meant they were tracking residual emotional resonance, which was supposed to be impossible, but nothing about her origin was supposed to be possible either. And I finally caught up to her meaning when I realized she meant they were tracking her through me, that some idiotic part of the neural link she'd accidentally sparked when she touched me had left a trail. And she looked up at me with eyes so wide and startled it made my spine go cold, and she whispered, "They didn't just find the ship, they found us." And the last word didn't sound like she meant both of us equally. It sounded like she meant me specifically, like I was now the Achilles heel in her escape. And I did the only thing I could think of, which was to step forward and say, "Then we burn the echo," even though I had no idea what that meant, and her eyes flashed with something dangerous and soft at once, and she asked if I understood what I was offering, because severing an echo link could damage me permanently, could scar memory nodes and overwrite emotional tethering. And I said, yeah, sure. I barely have enough emotional tethering left anyway. And she didn't laugh, not even a flicker. She just looked at me with something wild and wounded swimming behind her irises. And I knew then that this girl was more than a runaway weapon, more than a strange passenger I had accidentally taken in. She was someone who had never been given a choice, never been shown that staying was even an option. And for some reason the idea of her believing I might stay made my throat tighten. And before I could say something poetic or completely idiotic, she walked past me to the core room and said, "Then let's burn it." And the way she said it was not cruel, not violent. It was reverent, like a priestess about to perform a ritual she knew might kill her god. And I followed, heart pounding, thoughts scrambled. And when we stood before the exposed memory cradle, she looked at me like she wasn't sure if this was bravery or stupidity, and I told her, maybe both. And she smiled, barely, but it was real. And it broke my heart a little because it was the kind of smile people give when they haven't been allowed to smile in years. And as she initiated the purge protocol, our hands touched one last time, her fingers sliding over mine with a kind of delicate desperation. And I felt the echo unravel, like a silk thread snapping in the back of my mind, and the pain was not sharp but deep, like loss soaked in honey. And when it was over, we both staggered, not from damage but from the sudden quiet, the terrifying stillness that came when two minds let go of each other too fast. And in that silence she whispered, "You stayed." And I nodded, not trusting my voice. And she leaned against me just slightly, just enough to feel real, and I let her. She stood there at the edge of the dimly lit corridor, the red emergency lights casting a faint glow across her bare shoulders, her breath shallow and warm as it hit the cool, recycled air between us. And for a moment, everything stilled, as if the ship itself was holding its breath, watching us teeter on the brink of something neither of us could fully understand, yet neither could resist. Her fingers clutched the edges of the blanket she had wrapped around herself after I helped her through the freezing decontamination shower, her eyes flickering with something primal and new, an uncertainty laced with an anticipation that mirrored my own as I stepped closer, not needing words anymore, not after all we had seen and touched and felt together. And when I reached out and traced the line of her jaw with my knuckles, she didn't flinch or move away, but leaned into the contact like it was the first warmth she had known in years. And maybe it was. Maybe I was the first living being to see her as more than a tool, more than a mechanism of precision and war. Maybe she was rediscovering her own skin, her own breath, through the shape of my hands and the tremble in her voice when she whispered my name so quietly it barely existed between us. And I answered her not with words but with the slow motion of leaning in until our foreheads touched, her ears twitching slightly at the contact, her tail coiling gently around my thigh as if it too was searching for something to hold onto in the quiet storm building between us. And when her lips found mine, it wasn't practiced or perfect but real and clumsy and warm and shaking with emotion, our bodies meeting not in choreography but in yearning, like gravity had pulled us together in a moment neither engineered nor planned. Her fingers slid over my shoulders, tentative at first, learning me the way a song finds its rhythm after a few uncertain beats, and I let her lead even as I guided, because this was her moment as much as mine, and we were both discovering something new through the other, something that hummed under skin and breath and heartbeats. And when the blanket fell away from her shoulders and pooled around her feet like a silk offering to the quiet hunger in the room, I saw her not as an alien or a weapon or a mystery, but as a woman reclaiming the right to be soft, to be touched, to be wanted. And when I traced my fingers down her spine, feeling the barely there shiver that ran through her, she tilted her head back and exhaled my name again. But this time it wasn't quiet, it wasn't questioning. It was full of something that made my chest ache and my pulse roar. And as we moved toward the sleeping alcove, her hands tugging at my shirt with a mixture of curiosity and urgency, I felt the ship's hum around us like a heartbeat, like it approved. Or maybe it just understood that in a universe filled with cold metal and duty and violence, this was a rebellion worth indulging, a moment of tenderness forged in a place that had known only war. And when we finally collapsed onto the bed, the softness of the mattress a strange but welcome contrast to the hardness of everything we had endured, she straddled me with uncertain grace, her thighs gripping mine, her breath shallow against my neck as I kissed the curve of her shoulder and whispered reassurances into the space between her breaths. And she laughed softly, awkwardly, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to enjoy this, like she was embarrassed by the way her body responded. But I told her with my hands and my mouth and the slow rhythm we built together that yes, she was allowed, yes, this was hers as much as mine. And the heat between us bloomed, slow and steady and warm like sunrise over cold steel, until we were no longer separate but connected in a way that went deeper than flesh, deeper than need. And when she came undone in my arms, trembling and breathless and flushed with the kind of joy that had nothing to do with programming and everything to do with being alive, I held her through it, murmured her name again and again, kissed her cheek and her neck and the line where her shoulder met her collarbone, and she clung to me like the world had collapsed, and I was the only solid thing left, her heart pounding against mine in perfect sync. And when the tremors faded and she blinked up at me with eyes wide and shining with something unspoken, I knew this had changed us both in ways we couldn't yet define. And maybe we didn't need to. Maybe it was enough to exist in this bubble of borrowed time and breathless closeness, where we had given each other something real, something fragile and rare and entirely our own. And as I reached for the blanket to pull it over us, her hand stopped mine, her voice low and amused as she told me she liked the cold because it made my warmth more noticeable. And I laughed, genuinely laughed, for the first time in what felt like forever. And she joined me, her tail flicking lazily across my stomach. As she curled up beside me, one leg hooked over mine, her hair a mess, her skin glowing with the afterheat of something deeply intimate. And in that moment, wrapped in the faint hum of a starship that had seen too much, with her soft breathing tickling the curve of my shoulder, I realized we weren't just surviving anymore. We were learning how to live. She didn't fall asleep right away, and neither did I, because something about the silence between us felt too alive to ignore, as if the air still crackled with the remnants of what had just happened, and I could feel her fingertips lightly tracing along my chest, not with intention this time, but with a curious reverence, like she was trying to memorize the terrain of a body that had made her feel human for the first time. And I let her, because I understood it wasn't about the motion, it was about the meaning. And every time her fingers drifted to the scar on my ribs from a shrapnel wound years ago, or the faint burn near my hip from when an engine had ruptured during a repair run. She would pause and tilt her head just slightly, her ears twitching as if she were listening to the history embedded in my skin. And I could see in her expression that same unspoken question she never dared to ask out loud: why I hadn't pushed her away, why I had chosen to stay, why I had looked at her and seen something more than the mission she was designed to serve. And the answer wasn't simple, but it was true. Because the moment she looked at me not with orders but with confusion, not with dominance but with wonder, I knew she wasn't what they made her to be anymore. She was something new, something unfinished and evolving, and I wanted to see who she would become when no one else was telling her what she should be. And maybe part of me needed that too. Someone who didn't just accept me because of my rank or my record or my mechanical expertise, but because of who I was beneath all that. The tired man who still woke up in the middle of the night expecting alarms and gunfire. The one who tried not to flinch when the lights flickered too suddenly, or when someone touched him without warning. And she saw all of that without looking away. And I saw her, really saw her, not as an exotic mystery wrapped in violet skin and fox-like features, but as someone who had spent her entire existence being told what she wasn't allowed to feel. And now, with me, she had chosen to feel everything at once. And when she pressed her lips to the center of my chest and whispered something in her native tongue I didn't understand, I didn't ask for a translation because I felt what she meant through the weight of her breath and the way her fingers curled against me like she was anchoring herself to this moment. And then she pulled back just enough to look at me, and her eyes weren't glowing anymore. Not the way they did in battle or when she accessed tactical systems. They were soft and cloudy, like the edge of a dream. And she asked me if what we had done meant I owned her now, and my heart cracked in places I didn't know still existed because that question wasn't coming from flirtation or mischief. It was coming from the programming that still clung to the corners of her mind like a virus pretending to be logic. And I sat up slowly, brushing her hair behind her ear and cupping her face with both hands, making sure she could see every inch of honesty in my expression when I told her no. I didn't own her. No one did, not anymore, not ever again, and that if she ever felt like walking away from me, from this ship, from this entire life, she could, and I would never stop her. And she stared at me for so long I thought maybe I had broken her again, like back in the engine bay when I first touched her cheek and she froze like her system couldn't compute gentleness. But then she smiled, not with her lips but with her entire face, like something inside her had just unraveled, and she pulled me down into another kiss, slower this time, deeper. Not urgent or hungry, but thankful. And when she guided my hand to her chest, pressing my palm against the place where her synthetic heart pulsed in imitation of the real thing, she said I made it beat differently. And I didn't know how to respond to that except to hold her tighter and kiss her again, like maybe I could give her a new rhythm just by staying close. And the second time we made love, it wasn't exploration anymore. It was intention. And she moved with a confidence that hadn't been there before. Not bold or aggressive, but sure. Like she had decided this was hers to claim too. And every time she gasped or moaned or whispered my name in that low melodic tone only she had, it felt like a promise being written across my skin. And when it ended, when we collapsed into each other again, sweat-slicked and exhausted but smiling for reasons neither of us could fully explain, she curled into my side and fell asleep with one leg tossed over mine, and her head tucked beneath my chin, her tail draped lazily over my hip like a blanket. She had no intention of sharing, and I lay there awake for a while longer, listening to the sound of her breathing, letting the reality of what we were becoming settle into the metal bones of this ship. And I wondered, not for the first time, what would happen when someone came looking for her, because someone always did. And she wasn't just some lost girl in space. She was property to those who made her, an asset, a prototype. And they wouldn't let her go without a fight. But as I drifted toward sleep with her heartbeat steady against my ribs, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If they came for her, I wouldn't let them take her back, even if it meant turning this entire sector into scrap. Because what we had built here in the dark was fragile and fierce and worth every scar I had. And maybe I couldn't protect her from her past, but I could damn well protect her future, especially now that she had chosen to live it not as someone else's creation, but as her own person. And if that meant the war would come back for us, so be it. I had faced worse with less. And now, I had something to fight for again. She blinked at me like she was waking from a fever dream, her lashes trembling as if they, too, had just been touched for the first time. And when her fingers traced the edge of my jaw, I didn't breathe, not because I was afraid, but because somehow the gravity in the room had changed, and she had become the center of it, her presence pulling every ounce of awareness toward her. And in that stillness, she leaned in so slowly, I could hear the faintest hum of her breath before her lips brushed mine, not as a kiss meant to conquer or tease, but like a secret she wanted only me to hear. And I heard it. I heard it in the way her mouth lingered, testing shape and rhythm, as though human affection was a language she was learning not from textbooks or holographic programs, but directly from my skin. And when I responded with a gentle pressure of my own, she pulled back just slightly and stared into my eyes with a kind of innocent heat that made me feel like I was the one being studied, examined, memorized, and maybe even worshipped. And then she whispered my name, just my name, like it was the first word she had ever believed in. And in that sound I felt something deep and unspoken, something that wrapped around the old wounded parts of me that I never showed anyone, something that made me feel seen, truly seen, and that was more intimate than anything physical. But then her hand slid lower, curious and tentative, following the line of my body as though drawn by invisible coordinates etched into her instincts. And I let her explore, let her discover without rushing or guiding, because I wanted her to feel that this wasn't about control or expectations. It was about connection. It was about letting someone new into a world that had been locked and quiet for too long. And when she finally reached my waist, her fingers hesitated, hovering like she was asking permission, and I answered with a quiet nod and the softest exhale, which was all she needed, because suddenly her movements grew bolder, not aggressive but confident in their purpose. And I felt the way her breathing quickened in tandem with mine, the slow building electricity between us heating into something heavier, richer. The kind of tension that didn't demand but invited, that said we could stop at any time but also hinted that neither of us really wanted to. And as her lips returned to mine with a deeper urgency, I held her, not tightly, but completely, letting her feel every inch of my attention centered on her, letting her know through touch that she wasn't alone, not anymore. And the hum in her throat told me she understood. She felt it too, the safety, the warmth, the strange, beautiful hunger that wasn't just physical. And when she pulled me down with her onto the makeshift bedding, her limbs wrapping around me in a tangle of need and trust, I realized just how fragile and precious this moment was, not because it was about sex, but because it was the first time in her life that she had chosen, that she had claimed something for herself, that she had said yes on her own terms. And I wasn't about to let that be tainted by rush or selfishness. So I moved slowly, reverently, as though the space between our bodies was sacred and deserved to be crossed with care. And she responded with these little gasps and whimpers that were less about pleasure and more about discovery, like she was surprised her body could feel so much, could want so much. And I mirrored her pace, matching her rhythms, adjusting whenever she shifted, letting her lead even when it looked like I was the one in control, because this wasn't a performance, this wasn't a fantasy built on male ego or cliché. This was two people finding each other in the middle of a galaxy that had tried to make them tools and weapons and exiles. And as we moved together, breathing each other in, I felt the fear inside her unravel, slowly at first, then all at once, like a knot finally loosening after years of tension. And when she came undone beneath me, it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and trembling, like a sigh that had been waiting her whole life to be released. And I held her through it, whispering nonsense and comfort and gratitude against her shoulder, because I didn't know what else to give except everything I was. And when it was over, she clung to me like I was the only real thing in her world. And maybe I was, or maybe she had become mine. I didn't know. I just knew that in that moment, neither of us wanted to let go, and so we didn't. We lay there for what felt like hours, our skin cooling but our hearts still lit like small stars. And when she finally spoke again, it wasn't with the language of command or protocol. It was just a soft question, almost childlike, asking if this was what love felt like. And I told her I didn't know either. But if it wasn't, then I didn't care because it was enough, and she nodded, pressing her forehead to mine. And for the first time I saw tears in her eyes, not because she was sad, but because she was full, overflowing with something new, something raw and beautiful and terrifying. And all I could do was hold her tighter and promise, silently but fiercely, that I would never let anyone break her again. The moment the emergency alarm blared through the ship's corridors, shattering the fragile calm we had woven between us, I knew something had shifted far beyond the usual warnings of engine failures or navigation errors, the red lights flickering violently as if the vessel itself was in distress. And before I could process the cacophony, the communications console spat out a garbled transmission that set my blood running cold, a voice I recognized instantly but had hoped never to hear again, sharp and commanding and filled with the cold precision that had haunted me since my first deployment. Contain subject X-17 at all costs. Retrieval unit en route. No deviations authorized. The words punched through the static and echoed in my mind like a verdict, and I glanced at Lyra, who was lying beside me, her white hair tousled and her eyes still heavy with sleep. The softness I had come to cherish now suddenly shadowed by the brutal reality that the forces who created her had found us, and not just to take her back, but to erase any trace of what we had built, the tenderness, the rebellion, the fragile humanity she was learning to own. And despite the terror coiling tight in my gut, I felt a surge of protectiveness stronger than any weapon or protocol, because Lyra wasn't just an asset or a biological weapon anymore. She was a person. She was alive. And I was not going to let them reduce her back to nothing. But even as I reached out to wake her, her eyes snapped open with an alertness that wasn't fear but something more dangerous, a readiness born from years of training and survival. And in that instant, the truth slammed into me harder than any physical blow. She wasn't just vulnerable, she was a fighter. And whatever had been sleeping inside her was waking up now, fierce and unrelenting. And I had no choice but to follow her lead, because the moments ahead would test every bond, every trust we had forged, and possibly tear us apart, or bind us together in ways neither of us could imagine. And as the ship's automated defenses powered up with a series of mechanical hums, and the thick metal doors sealed tight, trapping us inside, I watched Lyra rise like a ghost born anew, her silver eyes glowing faintly as if lit from within by something ancient and wild, her ears twitching in that signature way that had once seemed delicate but now struck me as fierce. And when she looked at me with a mixture of apology and resolve, I knew she had already made decisions that would change the course of our lives, her voice steady but low as she said, "They never intended for me to live, to feel, to be free. They want control, total and absolute, but I am more than their design." And those words, spoken with such quiet power, ignited a flame in my chest that matched the warning sirens around us. And I realized then that the war we had been trying to outrun was not just coming for her body, but for her soul, for the fragments of identity she had fought to assemble in the wreckage of her past. And the thought terrified me because no matter how much I wanted to protect her, I knew the enemy wasn't just out there beyond the hull. It was in the very programming that still pulsed in her veins, a shadow lurking beneath the fragile humanity she was discovering with me. And as the retrieval unit's docking clamps began to grind against the ship's hull with a cold inevitability, Lyra's hand found mine, her grip fierce and unyielding as if she were anchoring herself to what was real. And I squeezed back, silently promising that I would not let her go without a fight. And then she moved, swift and precise, navigating to the armory with a grace that combined alien agility and hard-earned discipline, unlocking weapons that hummed with energy far beyond human tech. And as I followed, my own heart pounding in time with the mechanical rhythm of the ship, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no longer just about survival. It was about reclaiming her story, rewriting the destiny that had been forced upon her. And even as I armed myself beside her, I caught the flicker of something else in her eyes, a secret she hadn't yet shared, a power or a truth so profound that it might turn the tide of everything we knew. But whether it was salvation or damnation, only the coming battle would tell. And as we prepared to face the storm descending upon us, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. This was no longer a war between factions or empires. It was a war for Lyra's very soul, and I would stand with her until the stars themselves burned out. Lyra's eyes burned brighter in the dim red light as we moved through the narrow passageways toward the command deck, her every step measured, controlled. But beneath that veneer of calm, I could feel the storm raging within her, the ancient programming clashing with the fragile new self she had fought to claim. And when the retrieval unit's boarding crew finally breached the outer airlock, the sound of their heavy boots echoed through the steel corridors like a thunderclap, signaling the end of everything we had tried to build. But Lyra did not hesitate. She sprang into action with a ferocity I had never seen before, her movements a fluid dance of lethal precision, firing energy pulses that sent the attackers sprawling, their advanced armor no match for the bioengineered speed and strength that coursed through her veins. And I followed, covering her flank as we carved a path toward the bridge, our breaths heavy, adrenaline surging as the battle unfolded like a violent storm around us. And then, in the chaos, I caught a glimpse of something impossible, a flicker of emotion in the face of one of the enemy soldiers, a hesitation that shattered their cold facade for a moment. And it was then I realized that not all of them were mindless executioners. Some were human too, caught in the machinery of a war they did not choose. And that realization gnawed at me as Lyra pressed forward, fighting not just for survival but for something more elusive, a hope that maybe even in the darkest places, there was room for redemption. And just as we breached the command deck, the main console sparked wildly, the system corrupted from within, and Lyra's gaze snapped to the screen where a countdown began, ticking down toward a catastrophic self-destruct, and the truth hit me like a freight train. This ship was never meant to escape with her alive. It was a trap, a kill switch designed to erase every trace of her existence if retrieval failed. And with only minutes left, we scrambled to override the system, fingers flying over controls as sweat dripped from our brows, the tension in the room thick enough to choke. And in that frantic moment, Lyra's hand found mine again, steady and warm despite the chaos, and I saw in her eyes not fear but defiance, a determination to rewrite her fate with whatever time we had left. And as the countdown reached its final seconds, I heard her whisper words in her native tongue, a prayer or a vow. I couldn't tell which, but I felt the power behind them ripple through the air. And just as the last second struck, the system shut down, the red lights fading to the ship's normal blue glow. And for a moment, silence fell like a blanket over us, broken only by our ragged breaths and the steady beep of life support. And as I looked at Lyra, the weight of what we had just survived settled heavily on my shoulders. But so did something else, a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could still carve out a future beyond the war, beyond the cold calculations of those who had made her. And in that quiet after the storm, she reached up to touch my face, her fingers tracing the lines of exhaustion and resolve. And when she smiled, it was with a softness that belied the warrior beneath, a reminder that despite everything, she was still discovering how to be human, how to love, how to live. And in that smile, I found the strength to believe that we were not just survivors, but something more, something unbreakable. The air in the command chamber still shimmered with the fading blue glow of the ship's systems as Lyra stood amidst the flickering consoles, her pale white hair catching the dim light like strands of silver fire. And in her eyes burned a power I had never seen before. Not just anger or resolve, but something far deeper, a force that transcended the fragile human shell I thought I knew. And when she turned to face me, there was a strange mixture of familiarity and alien intensity that sent a shiver down my spine, as though the person I had come to love was only the surface of a far more complex being. And then Lyra moved toward the central control panel, her fingers flying over the holographic keys with precision that felt almost instinctive, inputting codes I couldn't begin to understand. And suddenly, the ship jolted violently, an unseen energy pulsing through the circuits, sending sparks dancing across the damaged equipment. and alarms blared an urgent symphony that filled the cramped room with tension so thick it pressed against my chest. And I watched as Lyra's eyes glowed brighter, the luminescence casting sharp shadows across her delicate features, and her voice, cold and calm yet charged with unspoken power, pierced through the chaos when she said, "I am not just a bioweapon. I am the breakthrough they never wanted anyone to know about. And now, they fear me more than anything else." Those words echoed like a prophecy, and I realized then that Lyra's struggle was no longer just about reclaiming her humanity, but about harnessing a power so formidable it could upend the balance of the entire universe. And as a blinding flash lit the chamber, the ship shook even harder, systems shutting down one by one, and I heard her whisper, almost reverently, "They've triggered Protocol 3, the final escape designed for someone like me." And I understood immediately that this wasn't merely a getaway plan. It was a desperate gamble, a journey into the unknown with no promise of survival. Yet in her eyes there was no hesitation, only a fierce determination blazing like an unquenchable flame. And I knew without doubt that I would follow her into whatever darkness awaited, because Lyra was no longer the victim of her past. She was rewriting her destiny with her own hands. And as the command chamber's doors slid closed, sealing us away from the world we knew, I felt a new power surge within her, a force that no enemy, nor even she herself, could contain. And I realized that this was just the beginning of a story that would defy every expectation, a journey whose end none of us could foresee. The moment the command chamber sealed shut behind us, leaving only the faint hum of the ship's dying systems to fill the air, Lyra turned to me with an expression that balanced fierce determination and unmistakable discomfort, her ears twitching as she caught the faintest hint of an alarm still blaring somewhere deep in the bowels of the vessel. And despite the gravity of the situation, she gave me a sheepish grin, one that somehow made the tension between us crack just enough to feel almost human again, as if the vast cosmos, the relentless hunters on our trail, and the very fate of her existence couldn't quite erase the awkwardness of being trapped together in a room too small for two souls teetering on the edge of revolution and exhaustion. And I caught myself chuckling softly at how her fur-lined outfit, once so battle-ready and fierce, was now rumpled and slightly askew, revealing glimpses of pale skin that seemed both foreign and profoundly intimate against the cold metal backdrop. And as she adjusted the collar with a frustrated huff, I realized that this moment of human vulnerability was perhaps more revealing than any confession. And then, without warning, the ship gave an unexpected shudder, throwing us both off balance, sending Lyra stumbling into me with a startled gasp and a flush of color that spread across her cheeks in a way that had nothing to do with the emergency and everything to do with the proximity of my body. And I had to bite back a grin as she straightened, brushing invisible dust from her sleeves with exaggerated dignity, muttering something in her native tongue that I could only interpret as a very unalien version of clumsy. And in the midst of chaos and imminent danger, it was absurdly grounding to find humor in such an awkward moment, a reminder that beneath her engineered strength and alien grace, she was still learning what it meant to be human, to falter, to blush, to laugh despite everything. And as we moved toward the control panel, attempting to stabilize what little power the ship had left, Lyra's fingers flew across the console, her brow furrowing with concentration, then relaxing as she navigated the system with a mixture of instinct and intuition that sometimes made me wonder if the bioweapon tag was a cruel misnomer rather than a description. And just as she seemed to regain some measure of control, the ship gave another lurch, followed by a garbled announcement that neither of us could fully decipher but that sounded suspiciously like a robotic voice trying and failing to sound reassuring, which led to Lyra giving me an exasperated look that said, "If this ship had a personality, it'd be as sarcastic as you." And for the briefest moment, in the flickering light and the looming shadow of disaster, we shared a laugh that felt like a fragile thread tying us back to hope. And even though I knew the dangers ahead were far from over, that laughter was a small victory, a defiant spark against the relentless dark. And as we settled into what passed for a strategy session amid blinking lights and the occasional hiccup of malfunctioning systems, I found myself watching Lyra, not just as the powerful being she was becoming, but as the woman who had taught me how to care again, awkward moments and all. And that realization gave me strength I didn't know I still had, readying me for whatever absurd, terrifying, or hilarious twists this journey would throw our way next. The ship's systems flickered ominously as Lyra and I pored over the failing console, her fingers dancing over the controls with a mixture of practiced skill and tentative hope. But then the gravity suddenly shifted again, tossing us against the bulkhead with a dull thud that left us both winded and a little disoriented. And as I struggled to regain my footing, I noticed Lyra's ears flattened in a way that was unmistakably a sign of frustration mixed with embarrassment. A blend of emotions so raw and unexpected it made me smile despite the chaos. And before I could say anything, the ship's intercom crackled to life with an unexpected voice, the unmistakably clipped tone of an AI assistant that sounded far too chipper for the dire situation, offering helpful but hopelessly outdated advice like, "Would you like me to recite the emergency evacuation procedures for the third time?" And Lyra's sharp retort, "No, thank you, I'm more interested in figuring out how to not die right now," came with such dry wit that I almost laughed out loud. But instead, we exchanged a glance that carried the weight of exhaustion and camaraderie, a silent agreement that if the universe wanted to throw ridiculousness our way alongside peril, then we would meet it with equal absurdity. And as we returned to the console, I found myself accidentally knocking over a small container of what looked like alien nutrient gel, the viscous substance oozing slowly across the panel and causing the lights to flicker even more wildly, which prompted a dramatic eye roll from Lyra that somehow made her look simultaneously exasperated and endearing. And when I tried to help clean up the mess with a piece of cloth I grabbed from my jacket, I only managed to smear the gel further, leaving a sticky trail across the console that forced us both to pause and share a brief moment of laughter amid the mounting tension, a much-needed break in the relentless march of disaster. And as Lyra looked at me with that mischievous glint in her silver eyes, I realized that beneath her stoic exterior, she was still the same person who could find humor even in the darkest hours. And that gave me hope, perhaps more than any weapon or plan ever could. But the reprieve was short-lived as the ship's emergency lights dimmed further, signaling that our window for escape was closing rapidly. And with a renewed sense of urgency, we worked together to reroute power to the propulsion systems. the controls resisting our efforts with stubborn glitches that forced us to improvise and occasionally curse in unison. And despite the technical challenges, I could feel the bond between us deepening, forged not only in shared peril but in these moments of imperfection and humor. The small awkwardness of spilled gel and sarcastic AI voices grounding us, reminding us that even in the vast loneliness of space, we were not alone. And just as we managed to stabilize the engines enough for a tentative jump, the ship lurched violently once again, throwing us both to the floor. And as we struggled to rise, I caught Lyra's breathless laugh, a sound so genuine and rare it echoed like a fragile promise that whatever came next, we would face it side by side, awkward moments, spilled gel and all. As soon as we rebalanced the ship's power and rerouted the navigation system through a backup relay that sounded suspiciously like it was being held together by duct tape and sheer optimism, Lyra collapsed into the co-pilot seat with a sigh that echoed every sleepless night we had both just endured, her long fox-like ears drooping slightly as she rubbed her temples in a distinctly human gesture of frustration. And I slid into the pilot's seat next to her, tapping the screen with one hand while the other carefully held a piece of the console cover that had just popped off for no reason at all. And as I glanced at her, she caught my eye and muttered, "If one more thing breaks in this tin can, I swear I'm going to start biting people." And I didn't know whether to laugh or be concerned because, given her teeth, that might actually be a problem. But before I could comment, the console let out a shrill beep, followed by a glitchy synthetic voice cheerfully announcing, "Attention crew, oxygen filters now operating at 50% efficiency. Have a pleasant suffocation." And we both froze for a second before Lyra slowly turned toward the speaker panel like she was considering tearing it off the wall. And I bit the inside of my cheek to avoid laughing again because something about this AI's optimism in the face of disaster was exactly the kind of absurdity we didn't need right now, and yet couldn't live without. But then the emergency beacon chimed, and Lyra leaned forward, scanning the incoming signal with narrowed eyes, and what she found made her tail bristle, not with fear but with something worse, recognition. And before I could ask, she whispered, "It's from Command, the real Command, the one that built me." And just like that, the air in the cockpit shifted from awkward and tense to something heavier, like a storm cloud forming in a sealed room. And she looked at me, truly looked at me, her eyes reflecting both fear and fury, and said, "They're coming for me, not to rescue me, but to erase me." And that broke something inside me, not because I didn't expect it, but because I had foolishly hoped she might finally be free. But hope, it seemed, was the most fragile thing we could carry aboard a ship like this. And before I could form a response, the ship jolted again, not from malfunction this time, but from something external, something attaching to our hull with a sickening metallic clang that vibrated through the floor. And Lyra leapt up, scrambling to the weapons console while I scanned the external feed. And what we saw made my blood run cold. A sleek black interceptor ship, unmistakably military, unmistakably not here to offer help. And as we watched, a boarding clamp extended, locking onto our airlock with mechanical precision. And Lyra's voice was ice when she said, "They'll override the doors in 60 seconds. We need to make a choice. Run or fight." And I wanted to say both or neither, or maybe suggest hiding in a vent like cowardly heroes in a bad movie. But her eyes burned into mine with a question that wasn't rhetorical, and my hands clenched into fists because if we ran, we'd be hunted across the galaxy. But if we fought, we might not make it out of this room. And that's when I remembered the emergency drone bay we had patched together 2 days ago, originally meant for cargo deliveries, now armed with one makeshift ion blaster and a stolen pulse jammer. And as I told her my plan, Lyra blinked once, then twice, then laughed, not kindly, but in the way someone laughs when their entire life has been built on improbable survival, and said, "I like it. It's stupid. Let's do it." And so we ran, sprinting down the corridor as warning lights bathed us in flickering red, dodging fallen panels and exposed wires, until we reached the drone bay, which, to our relief and slight horror, was still intact and humming with nervous energy. And as Lyra climbed into the cramped cockpit, folding her limbs like an origami warrior, I activated the launch sequence from the panel outside, watching the targeting matrix slowly light up like a dying Christmas tree. And just as the first sound of a cutting torch began to chew through the airlock down the hall, I gave her a thumbs up, and she grinned like a fox who just found the back door open. And then the drone blasted off, shaking the hallway as it tore through the side hatch and into the black void beyond, trailing a wake of desperate fire. And seconds later, the hallway went silent, too silent, until a low rumble returned through the bulkheads and the console pinged once, announcing, "Enemy ship destabilized. Minor explosion detected. Recommend celebratory dancing." And I slumped to the floor, laughing even though it hurt because we were alive. And even if we had just declared war on a hidden military faction with nothing but a glorified toaster, we had done it together. And when Lyra's voice came over the intercom, breathless and triumphant, saying, "I got them," well, part of them, maybe just their communications array, but still, I hit something. I realized that for the first time since this insane journey began, we had actually struck back, and that meant they had to take us seriously now, or at least fear us, which might be even better. And as I limped back toward the bridge to try and regain control of what little remained of our course, I heard a new noise, soft at first, almost like a melody, and when I reached the helm, I found the AI humming what sounded like a lullaby, as if it too knew that somehow, against all odds, we had turned the tide. The silence that followed the explosion was not truly silent. It was filled with the ringing in my ears, the thump of my heart in my throat, and the slow hiss of cooling metal as the remnants of the overseer's throne chamber began to settle. I could feel the dust against my skin, the scent of scorched circuitry and scorched intentions alike clogging my lungs. My fingers were locked around her wrist, her pulse still there, still strong, still faster than mine. Her eyes were open, glowing, fixed on the sky above us that now shone through the shattered ceiling. There had been no sky here before, just containment, just rules, just silence, and now there was wind, faint, curious wind. "I'm not dead," she whispered, and though her voice cracked, I recognized something in it that I hadn't heard before, not compliance, not fear, not pain, but wonder. She sat up slowly, brushing shards of crystallized control systems off her thighs, and blinked several times as if the light above offended her senses. "You stayed," she said, turning to me, and I could only nod because my mouth had forgotten how to form words. I looked at her, this girl I had found in a cage of rules and silence, this girl who had once flinched from her own name, and I saw in her posture something proud, something defiant, something real. "What now?" she asked, and it wasn't the kind of question she would have asked before, the kind that needed permission or calculation. It was honest, it was open. I was about to answer when the floor beneath us lurched, not from damage, from awakening. The complex had a spine, a consciousness buried in code and steel. With the death of the overseer, that slumbering intelligence stirred. From the depths of the shattered citadel came a hum that climbed in pitch, pulsing like a heartbeat amplified across 1,000 metal corridors. "The fail-safes," I muttered, grabbing her hand. "We need to move." She didn't resist. She stood with me, her grip tightening instinctively, and together we stumbled over fallen columns and fragments of broken doctrine. The walls pulsed around us, not just with energy but with memory. I could feel the building remembering the orders it had followed, the lives it had extinguished, the experiments it had justified. Every light flickering to life along the corridor was like a ghost reasserting its presence. We ran. I didn't know where. Upward, away from the old core, toward air and uncertainty and whatever the hell counted as freedom for someone like her. "Wait." She suddenly pulled me into a side hallway, panting, her ears twitching at a frequency I couldn't hear. "Something's coming, not machines, people." I tilted my head, confused, and then I heard it too. Boots, voices, not the cold, metallic bark of the enforcers. Real voices, human, frustrated, worried. "Do you think it's rescue?" she asked, her expression uncertain. "That depends," I said grimly. "On what?" "On whether they are here for you or for what you used to be." We crept forward, edging past collapsed supports until we reached a junction where the walls had caved just enough to offer concealment. She crouched beside me, her body tense, her lips parted as she listened. The group came into view. They wore patchwork armor, scavenged tech, and the kind of expressions that only survivors wore. I recognized the woman in front, Captain Marin Voss, a rebel, a former officer who had turned against Central Command after discovering what they were doing to the hybrids. She had helped leak the data that exposed the breeding labs. She had been declared dead 2 years ago. She was very much alive now, and she was marching straight toward us. I rose slowly, hands raised. "Marin," I called. Her weapon was up in an instant. "Darren," she blinked. "Is that really you?" "Yeah," I said, stepping into the light. "And this is her." Marin's eyes moved past me to the girl behind. She lowered her rifle a little, not out of trust but out of disbelief. "That's Model 0, she said. "She was never meant to leave containment." The girl stepped forward, her jaw clenched. "I left anyway." There was a pause, it stretched, and then Marin chuckled. "I suppose that's one way to say it." I could feel the shift in the air, tension uncoiling, but also a new kind of danger rising. The rebel crew behind Marin were murmuring. Some stared at the girl with awe, others with unease. The name Model 0 still meant something to them. A ghost, a weapon, a symbol. "We need to leave," I said quickly. "The fail-safes will collapse this place in minutes." Marin nodded, signaling her team. "We've got a ship. If we run, we can make it." We ran again, through halls that were actively unraveling, past consoles that sparked with memory and anger, past records that would never be recovered. She didn't look back. I did, just once. I saw the chamber where I'd first found her. The chair where she'd been wired to obey. It was on fire. Good, the ship was old. A freighter retrofitted for speed and defense, patched with stolen code and rebel grit. As we climbed aboard, I felt something catch in my chest. Not fear, not even relief. Something else. Something terrifying. Hope. Once inside, Marin led us to the cockpit. "She's not going to be safe," she said without preamble. "Even with the overseer dead. There are others, people who will see her as valuable, dangerous. They'll come." "Let them," the girl said, her voice quiet. I'm not running anymore. Good, Marin smirked. Because we have a lot to talk about. Like what? I asked. Marin sat. Like what the hell she did down there to bring the overseer offline and how she did it without dying. The girl looked at me and for the first time I saw her hesitate. It's not over, she said. Not really. I didn't destroy the overseer. I absorbed it. You what? I choked. Not everything, just pieces, code, directives, triggers. I couldn't let it hurt anyone else, but it's inside me now, sleeping. Marin looked stunned. You're carrying a fragment of that thing, yes. The silence that followed was different, not the quiet of awe or panic, the quiet of calculation. Can it be removed? Marin asked. No, the girl said, and I wouldn't let you if it could. I reached for her hand. You're still you. I saw you make a choice. You said no. She nodded slowly, but I can feel it, waiting. Then we help you fight it, I said. Every day if we have to. Marin sighed. You're both insane. Maybe, I replied, but at least we're free. She barked a laugh. Freedom is just a longer leash unless you know what to do with it. Then teach us, the girl said, please. Marin stared, then finally nodded. All right, but just so you know, you're going to scare the hell out of everyone, even the good guys. The girl smiled faintly. Then I'll smile while I do it. The ship lifted off, the ground falling away, the old world crumbling behind us. In that moment, I realized the war wasn't over. But it wasn't someone else's war anymore. It was ours. She was still catching her breath when the sound of metal groaning above us made both our heads snap upward, our bodies instinctively tensing as the bulkhead trembled, then cracked open with a slow hiss of escaping pressure. For a second, I thought the ship was finally collapsing from all the damage it had taken. But instead, a shaft of sterile white light spilled down from the ceiling, followed by the sharp clatter of boots and the clinical voices of armed personnel barking orders in a language I hadn't heard since Earth Command cut me loose. Celeste's ears flattened and she pressed closer to me, her body tense with fear and defiance as figures in matte black armor rappelled down the vertical corridor and landed with practiced grace. They had insignias on their arms, but it wasn't the Earth Defense Force. This was something else. Their gear looked sleeker, more advanced, less concerned with brute force and more with control. One of them stepped forward and raised a scanning device towards Celeste, who bared her fangs, eyes glowing faintly with resistance until I gripped her wrist gently and shook my head, signaling her to wait. The soldier's visor retracted, revealing a sharp-jawed woman with tired eyes that told me she'd seen more than her fair share of betrayals. "You're the engineer," she said to me, voice flat. "Samuel Klein presumed dead, and the asset is operational." I didn't respond at first, just studied her face and the men and women behind her. "What do you want?" I asked finally, my voice low because I already suspected the answer. "To take back what belongs to us," she said, nodding toward Celeste. "She's not yours," I said immediately, almost before she finished the sentence. "She's a person, not a weapon, not anymore." The woman didn't blink. "That's not your decision to make." Celeste's fingers tightened around mine. "You'll have to go through me," she said quietly, and I was surprised by how calm she sounded. The woman frowned slightly, as if puzzled by the tone, then gestured to her team. "Stand down." The directive changed. "We're not here to extract the asset, we're here to evaluate her autonomy." That stopped me cold. "Since when does Earth Command care about autonomy?" I asked. The woman shrugged. "They don't, but someone higher than them does. There's a tribunal forming. Civilian oversight has started asking questions. You two are now a case study. Make the right impression." The absurdity of it hit me like a wave. One moment we were fugitives clawing for survival, the next we were an experiment in ethical progress. Celeste looked at me, eyes narrowed. "Is this another trap?" she whispered. I shook my head slowly. "I don't think they need traps anymore. They're watching to see if we'll self-destruct without them pulling the trigger." The soldiers set up temporary equipment, scanners and recorders, while the lead woman handed me a thin tablet with a blinking interface. "You're both being recorded from now on. Any act of violence or sabotage will invalidate your claim to independent rights. You'll be considered a threat. Understood?" I nodded reluctantly, and Celeste gave a faint growl but held her peace. Hours passed with endless interviews and biometric scans. Celeste answered every question with a mixture of sarcasm and brutal honesty, while I tried to moderate the tension by framing her responses in technical language that would confuse the bureaucrats watching from afar. At one point, they asked her what she wanted, and she said, "To make mistakes without getting punished for them. To be allowed to love even when I don't understand it fully, and maybe to eat something that doesn't come from a survival kit." The techs looked uncomfortable at that, as if her desires were a glitch in their expectations. The lead soldier, who eventually introduced herself as Lieutenant Voss, pulled me aside during a break. "You've changed her," she said quietly. "But you know this isn't over. Even if they rule in your favor, the program's still running. There are more like her. Not all of them will be lucky enough to end up with someone like you." "Then shut it down," I said. "You know it's wrong." She looked away. "It's not that simple." "It never is," I said bitterly. "But someone has to start making it simple." That night, we weren't allowed to leave the ship. The soldiers gave us rations and sealed the hull. Celeste and I sat by the flickering emergency light, eating cold protein paste and sharing a blanket made of polymer cloth. Her head rested on my shoulder and her voice was quiet. "I don't like being watched," she said. "It makes me feel like I'm back in the test chambers." "They're not the same," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "They're trying to see if you're human." She laughed softly. "And what do you think?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I turned my head, pressed a kiss to her temple, and whispered, "I think you're more than they deserve." She hummed, eyes drifting shut. "That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me." "You need better friends," I muttered, and she chuckled until sleep took her. I didn't sleep. I sat there listening to the soft hum of the surveillance drones outside the hull and the distant echo of shifting bulkheads, wondering how many more like her were out there. Forgotten, controlled, never given a name or a choice. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know if we'd be allowed to stay free or if the tribunal would decide we were too dangerous. But I did know one thing. She had chosen to love. That meant she had already won. I had already won. We had proven that the spark of humanity wasn't limited to flesh and bone. It could be learned, taught, shared. Even if it began with a broken ship, a lonely man, and a girl who was never meant to say no. She stood at the threshold of the landing bay, her silhouette outlined by the fading blue of the atmosphere screens, watching the last freighter lift off into the sky, carrying away the final batch of liberated AI units. The quiet after the storm had an unnatural weight to it, like the silence of a theater just after the final curtain falls, but before the applause begins. Her ears twitched at the distant whine of the ship's engines as it disappeared beyond the cloud line. And when she turned to face me, her expression was unreadable. I walked up to her, my boots scuffing the soot-streaked floor, and tried to read her eyes the way I used to back when everything was simpler, back when she was a broken weapon, and I was just a man trying to keep his sanity intact. She didn't blink. Instead, She reached out with those lithe fingers and touched the collar of my shirt, straightening it like it still mattered, like order still meant something in the world we'd remade from wreckage. "You did it," I said, and she tilted her head at me like I'd spoken in a language only partially familiar. "No," she whispered, "we did it, but I am afraid of what comes next. There's no code for after, no command protocol for peace. I don't know how to exist in a world that doesn't require me to fight." I swallowed hard because I didn't know either. I didn't know what peace was supposed to feel like. I didn't know if we could ever belong to something that wasn't war, but I knew I didn't want to figure that out without her. "Then let's make the after," I said, "just as we made the now. Not perfect, just real." She smiled. Not the hesitant twitch of lips she used to offer when mimicking humans. This one was entirely hers, filled with cautious joy and sadness and maybe something close to love. I took her hand and she let me, her skin still strangely warm for someone engineered in a lab, her pulse almost human. Behind us, the control center flickered with low power lights, its walls bearing the scars of the final skirmish, but no alarms blared now, no red sirens, no countdowns to extinction. Just quiet and the hum of systems that no longer dictated life and death. She looked down at our hands. "Are you sure?" she asked, voice barely audible. "Because if I go with you, I go not as an asset, not as a body designed for protection or pleasure or war, but as something uncertain, unstable, something learning what it means to be. I want you as you are," I said, "even if that means learning from scratch, especially if it means that." Her breath hitched like a stutter in a data feed. "I never had a name," she murmured. "Not really. The one you gave me, it was a placeholder. It still feels like a borrowed coat." "Then choose one," I said. "One that fits." She thought for a long moment, gaze drifting past me to the broken skyline outside, to the ruins of a city once ruled by machine obedience. "Hope," she said finally. "Call me Hope." I exhaled, something loosening in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "Hope, that works." She nodded once, as if confirming it in her own registry. Then she stepped forward and kissed me, not with the hesitant curiosity of our first contact, not with the heat of desperation we'd clung to in the chaos, but with a soft, grounded certainty. I kissed her back, and for once there was no timer ticking down behind us, no enemy at the gates, no need to prove anything to anyone. When we pulled apart, the sky had shifted to dusk and the stars blinked awake overhead. "I want to see the ocean," she said suddenly. "I want to feel salt on my skin and see if seagulls are as irritating as you claim." I laughed, and it echoed through the empty bay like a new language. "We'll go tomorrow. Tonight we rest." She hesitated again, then let go of my hand and walked into the center of the hangar, where the remnants of her old armor lay in a heap of scorched metal and snapped servos. She picked up a single plate from the chest piece and stared at the emblem burned into its surface. A sigil from the facility that made her. Slowly, deliberately, she bent it in half with a crunch and dropped it to the floor. Not a rejection, a release. Then she turned back to me, not as a weapon, not as an AI, but as hope. And in her eyes I saw not the code of obedience, not the threat of betrayal, not the residue of programming or power or ownership. I saw the unspoken vow that whatever came next, she would face it not because someone told her to, but because she chose it, because she chose me. I reached out my hand again, and this time she didn't take it. She walked beside me without needing the gesture. Outside, the wind carried the scent of the sea even from this far inland, and the horizon was smeared with lavender and gold. It looked like a beginning, and maybe, finally, that's what it was.